All right, it's probably being recorded now then.
Yes.
Hello everyone, my name is Justin. Welcome to Bloom week two. Week two? Week two. This week we're going to be covering typography and how to basically use and select fonts and a little bit of font stuff for the web too. Let's get started. Okay, so I want to preface like all of this workshop with a giant asterisk. Literally everything I say should be appended with an asterisk saying it depends, because like most of design, everything's like a soft science. There's really no absolutes. So most of the things I say, they're like generally how you should think about things, but nothing's like finite. Boundaries, social construct, all of that. Yeah. I'm also going to be like skipping a lot of important stuff in the world of typography, just because we don't have time to like dive into the nitty gritty, and I'll explain a little more about this later. I'm also like extremely forgetful, and I don't have like a script for any of these slides. I'm just remembering what I want to say on each slide as I get to it. So I might miss something that's really important. So if I say something that's like completely confusing and doesn't make any sense, just call me out on it in the Q&A after, and I will answer any question about anything that's confusing. And lastly, yeah, a lot of this stuff is like very beginner driven. So like touching back on the whole asterisk point and skipping a lot of things, I'm not, like how every one of your physics teachers probably lied to you in high school about like 20 different things and you just found out about it coming to UCLA. I'm going to be doing that with typography. I'm going to make a lot of like sweeping claims that aren't really applicable to every situation, but once again, beginner course, don't need to worry about it. We'll touch on the details. Yeah. Oh, and lastly, I'm like not an expert at all. I literally just graduated UCLA. I've been doing like graphic design for like 7-8 years now, and product design for like 4. I still have like a lot more to learn, so I'm by no means like a good source on typography. But Sam and Brian asked me to help out with this, and it's like, yeah, so they're stuck with me now. Cool. Questions on the marking post I'm going to answer just right off the bat. The first question was why are there so many fonts? There's many fonts because there's a lot of different feelings and vibes that exist. So this is basically why there's fonts. It's not a very good answer, but that's basically it. Arial. So the second question was why do Arial and Helvetica look the same? Arial is sort of like the bastard offspring of Helvetica. Helvetica was basically like licensed by Apple for their Macintosh computers, and then down the road, Microsoft was like, "Hey, we really like that font, but we can't have it because we need to pay Apple a lot of money for it. So we'll make our own version, Arial, that has literally the same exact metrics, but looks like a little bit different, and it's worse, and we'll just roll with that." So that's why Arial's a thing. And thirdly, Comic Sans. Yeah, Comic Sans is the way it is because it was meant for kids at first. It was based off comic books, which is why it's called Comic Sans. But yeah, and now everyone uses it because no one really knows when to use Comic Sans. But the good thing about it is that it's really like accessible for people with dyslexia. So if you're looking at use cases in that realm, that's a good font to look at. Anyways, now to the actual content. So in this workshop, we're going to be going over a few things. We're first going to start off with explaining like what is typography. Like that's a really fancy word. It really just means like fonts, but there's of course like a lot more nuance in it. But for the most part, we're just going to be looking at like fonts. Next, we're going to look at like how you do typography, like how you basically use fonts, how do you select them. But before we do that, actually, we're going to cover why you should care about typography. And these are going to be like really brief points, but they're very important. So I definitely want to cover them. So then after that, we'll actually go into how you do typography, all of the details in that realm. And then we're going to do our workshop. So after we cover how to do typography, we'll post a link below where you can duplicate a Figma file, where you can have access to these slides and the workshop that we're going to go over. And I'll also like demonstrate a little bit there what that's going to look like. All right, let's get started. So what is typography? I could dive into like the history of like the printing press and like how people made letters and stuff, and that bruh in the middle, you probably recognize on the $100 bill, why he's relevant at all. But like honestly, what I said in the beginning, this is going to be very beginner friendly. I'm not going to go through like the historical context, even though it's super important. Um, it's just I don't want to bore all of y'all, and I do care what you all think about me, so we're going to skip over that for now. The most important part basically that you should know about a lot of typography is that a lot of fonts that exist today and people still use today were basically rooted in these metal blocks that were essentially like fonts. People would have these blocks, they'd line them up to form words, and then they put ink on it and like put it on the page, and that's how people printed stuff consistently. A lot of the way fonts exist today basically take after this like metal casing right here. And so this is just like really important to know, because there's going to be a lot of things in fonts that are like, why would you ever do this? This makes no sense on a computer. That's because it didn't make sense on a computer. It only made sense in the real world. So yeah, we're mainly going to be covering like fonts as they exist in the computational realm, I guess, as you want to call it, mainly websites and web apps, and basically stuff that's relevant for y'all who are doing the Bloom course. So now that we covered like what is typography, in like a very, very broad sense, we're gonna be covering like why you should actually care about typography. It's like more than just figuring out like how to meme properly, but there's a really good definition that I think explains why fonts are important really well. And I have a terrible memory, so I'm gonna pull out this book that actually has it. The guy who wrote the book, his name is David Reinfurt. He describes it as this: typography has something of a split personality. It's both the technical act of writing words into the world by giving them form, and it's also a way of understanding the world through the forms of its writing. So like that's basically a fancy way of saying like fonts are sort of a two-way street. Everyone knows about fonts as like the way you basically turn words into a physical or digital visual form. Words can't exist in a visual sense without a font, the same way that words don't exist in a vocal sense without a language. You need the font to sort of carry that quality of the word's existence in the physical world or digital world, in a visual world, basically. But it's also about understanding the way the world and the way that we lay out words in the world indicate how fonts and words should be used. And the other quote that David Reinfurt uses is that, yeah, writing gives an impression of things, and conversely, things can give an impression of writing. It's a two-way street. It's very important to understand like why fonts are the way they are. You can understand like the political implications of fonts, the historical, the sociological. There's a lot of history and importance behind fonts, and it might seem like really trivial, like who the fuck cares about Arial versus Helvetica? But if you like trace down the history, you can see, you know, fonts tied to the rise of like Germany's Hitler nationalism, or you can look at the way fonts are used in political sense in 2020. There's like a lot of different angles to look at it. For this workshop, we're only going to be looking about how to bring words into the world and not really analyzing the world through the words that are in it. But I just want to clarify that like that's really important to know, and I'm not qualified to really go over all of the details in that realm. So I'm also not going to like dive too much deeper into that. This is going to be like the last you hear from me on this like font philosophical sense. We're getting purely into technicals from here on out. So yeah, cool. So we've covered what typography is and why it's important. So now we're going to cover how you basically do typography. The two sections we're going to be going over here. And I feel like I'm going a little fast, but so if there's any questions you have, just write them down or type them somewhere and then shoot them after. I will answer every single question to the best of my ability. Yeah, so we've sort of covered like what fonts are, like why they matter, like sort of the idea behind where they came from. This is the stuff that's actually going to be relevant for you. How do you use them? So part one, we're going to go over choosing fonts and what that even means. So to get started, most of y'all probably know about serif and sans serif fonts. These are the two categories of fonts that pretty much comprise of all fonts that exist. Again, like everything is a broad stroke for the most part, but there's like a lot of in between in all of these categories, but these are like the two main categories. They're delineated by the serif, which is that little like thingy at the end of like letters. You probably know this if you've like ever looked at Times New Roman versus Arial. You probably know this actually because like one of your high school teachers or college professors were like, use these fonts because you should, never explain why. I'll go a little bit into that, but yeah, basically serifs are these like little things at the end of letters. And they basically come from like the old Roman alphabet where like people are like obsessed with those like really cool shapes. And like some bros were basically like, oh, let's put circles to like measure out all of these things so that they look really aesthetic and look really nice. And for the longest time, like serifs were like the shit. Like if you had a serif font that was good, it was like superior. But now it's like, as you're pretty aware, like with the advent of the web and like a lot more different types of media, serifs are kind of like outdated. Well, not outdated, but they're not, there's a lot more sans serifs, which we'll cover in a bit. So like different ways that serifs are used, most commonly is in print, but it's also used now in branding when you want to have like a regal or an established look, like many sport teams have with their logos, or like some inferior schools have with their school logos. The other side of this is sans serifs. And so these are basically serifs minus, I mean, serif fonts minus the serifs. So sans serif without serif. Bonus points if you know that bro in the corner right there. But yeah, you basically just don't have those little like ornamental things at the end of letters and you get like a much cleaner look. And what do you know? It's more legible. Or okay, technically not true, but for the web, it's like a lot nicer. So you see these often in like basically any web app today is going to use a sans serif font. Literally any tech company's logo, like the word mark that they use, whether it's like, I don't know, Google, Facebook, or even like startup, like 99.9% chance they're gonna have a sans serif on the words. And then UCLA, it's a nice, clean sans serif logo. I'm sure everyone has seen at this point many times on my UCLA. So we're gonna go over 3 different types of sans serif fonts, because these are sort of like categories that will help you figure out what font you want for whatever project you're working on. You probably don't know the names of, these are not the names of the fonts, by the way, these are just an example, but you probably have not heard of, or maybe heard in passing, like the name of these fonts. I mean, the name of these categories. They'll just like, basically, if you're looking for similar vibes, they're basically like the biggest categories of vibes. Yes, we stand. So the first category is geometric. These are fonts that are very circular, as the name might imply. All the E's and the O's you can see are very circular. They don't really deviate much from like a pure circle shape. And the stroke width of each letter, meaning like the width between like the 2 sides of like an I, for example, that basically stays consistent for the most part in like most geometric fonts. That's like the defining characteristics of a geometric font. So this geometric font is called Futura. It's a pretty popular font. It was like used basically like almost everywhere now. I think Nike's main font is like a version of this, but condensed and bold. You'll see this font a lot. You have font a lot. But yeah, super popular, super big category. The second type of font category I want to cover is humanist fonts. So these are fonts that are meant to like emulate the way we write. So they look very similar to, not very similar, but they look a lot more natural in shape. They're like organic, if you want to call it, all natural, gluten-free. They're tend to be used in contexts where you don't really care about aesthetic and you're like very much looking for to communicate that something is human. This one in particular is called Lato, L-A-T-O, and it's used in Slack. So if you've ever used Slack, you probably recognize this font. And then the last category is grotesque. So this is basically the most popular category right now. It's the font, it's the category that Helvetica falls under, or the broad category. Again, like I'm using a lot of sweeping terms. There's a lot of like in between these different categories. So I'm not really diving into that, but for the most part, these three categories are the ones you need to know. Grotesque fonts are, they come from like this really old style of fonts in like, I think like the 1900s or late 1800s. But basically they were like the OG versions of the sans serif fonts, and they're actually called grotesque because at the time people were like, these are so ugly, like why would you ever use these over a serif font? And now people are like, why would you ever use a serif font over like Helvetica? So and yeah, this font, as Lisa pointed out, is Helvetica. It's a family of fonts that you've definitely heard of. It has a really interesting backstory. There's even a documentary on it. Not going to go into that, but you should definitely get out when you have time. Cool. So now we're going to talk about like the two sort of main categories of fonts that you're going to encounter for the projects that you're going to be working on. And these are display fonts and body fonts. So as they may imply, the display is often for displaying. It's more of like your presentational, and the body is more of a, takes more of a utility purpose. So the two categories here that you should really be looking at these at are like your display font. You want the vibes, like all of that is in the display font, most of that. The body font is going to be mainly for utility. You want this to be legible at different sizes. And we'll go into the details in a bit, but yeah. And generally, so, okay, tip number one, and these are all going to be available on the slide, so you don't need to worry about like writing them down. Tip number one is that for your project, you should probably go for like 2 fonts max. Only go for 3, basically, once you have a good sense of what you're doing with the fonts and like the different purposes of the different fonts. A good example of a website that uses 3 fonts very effectively is the New Yorker. They have like this really nice like Art Deco-ish ornamental font that they use for all their headings, and it's super nice. But it's like not very legible for like a lot of text. So because of that, for their descriptions, they have this serif font. I actually don't know what the font is off the top of my head, but it's like really nice, and you can see that it has this more like traditional look to it. And they have these sans serif fonts for their authors or for their headlines, all these things that are like a lot more minor in detail, but still need to be clear. So about the vibes, about the display font, you want to make sure that this font that you choose for your display has a lot of personality, has a lot of substance. It's like basically what you're trying to communicate is probably the most like artistically forward part of your typography that you're going to have. So you want to make sure it communicates like what you're trying to go for. Figuring out that part of like, oh, is this font like the vibe I'm aiming for? That's like a really hard part, and that's something you really just build up with time and just training your eyes to get good at. But it's definitely like the most fun of like choosing a font. So definitely, yeah, you'll know what you're looking for. And another part is that, yeah, fonts, these fonts are going to look, you want to make sure they look great at different sizes. A lot of fonts that are meant to be like purely utility fonts, they're designed in a way that look great at small sizes. These display fonts that you want to like capture your vibes, you want to make sure those are big and look well big, because those are going to be like probably your biggest text on your screen. So for the utility font, you want to make sure that this font is flexible and doesn't really dominate over the content that you have on the page. It shouldn't really be like the core of the content. Its main point is to channel the text or the navigation or the UI, all of these other factors. They want to make those basically should be communicated clearly through this utility body font. And yeah, for this one, you want to make sure it's legible at different sizes. So you don't have to worry too much about it looking great, but it should be legible. And that means that, well, there's a lot of things that go into that. For the most part, you don't want to go for a serif font on a very small size because all of the ornaments on the serif will make it harder to see. You want to typically go for like fonts that look, I mean, you'll know when a font is legible, but you just want to make sure that at different sizes, it's also legible. Yeah, cool. So that was part 1. Next, we'll be going over how to use different fonts. So now this is assuming you figured out what fonts you want for your project, and now you're looking at, okay, we have these fonts, how do I use them in context of what I'm making? So I imagine most of y'all are probably going to be doing websites. A lot of these examples are websites, so sort of like look at them for reference. So for your display font, how should you be using your display font? You want to make sure that your display font is big, but like not too big. Don't overdo it. Don't like make the words streaming off the page, or else you're just losing the whole point of having it in a font. It's not going to communicate anything. And a really nice balanced example that I found was this website called Progress Parade. They have this nice bold retro serif, I think it's called Ricoletta, on their header, and it's nice. It's spaced widely, it's bold against the background, and it takes up the space that it should be taking, and it doesn't. It's like clipped. The bounding box is like capped at a width so that there's not like a ton of words each line. It's all around well balanced. This is like an example of a display font used really well. Another tip, so tip number 3 is to say more with less. So what this means is that even though you have, let's say, like a really nice font at your disposal, you don't want to have like a whole paragraph in this font. These fonts are often made to look well with just a few words. Actually, most of these fonts take their source from being used as newspaper headlines or marketing headlines, things that are meant to catch your eye and not really like be read ad nauseum. So in this situation, excuse me, you don't want to have like a ton of words. So a good example I found was this website called Wheel of Foreplay. There's a sex positive environment. So for example, this website has a really short headline and it's very tongue-in-cheek about its usage, but also uses the color and the space well with just a few words. They even have a second display font interlaced with the display font they choose, and it really communicates like what they're trying to say. Yes, Brian, indeed, the font on the site is hot. But it's great. It's a great example of like a great display font used really well. So we covered display fonts. We covered that you shouldn't make them too big. We covered that you shouldn't have a lot of content in them. Now we're gonna cover body fonts, or the utility font as I was referring to earlier. So tip number 4 is to left align your text. And what that means is you should generally move your text to the left, have it like, unless, I mean, in the rare case that you're actually in a right to left language, ignore this. But for the most part, if you're using English, you want to do left to right. And not only do you want to have your text left to right, but you want to align all of your text to relatively the same vertical axis. This will make it so that when people are reading, their eyes aren't jumping around at the different starting points of lines. It's a very consistent point that people can just look at and read from. Don't justify. That means is there's an option for most text where you can stretch it so that the space in between the words is spaced so that the letters themselves reach the other end of the whatever bounding column your text is in. You see this often in newspapers where the lines are like perfectly square. This is mainly for like an aesthetic purpose. It's not really good from a legibility point of view, so don't do that. A really well-known example of left-aligned text is New York subway signage. For example, other signs basically left-aligned. It's in like Helvetica. It's really bold and crisp. And despite the screenshot being like, 2 pixels wide, most of the Times Square, the New York subway signage is pretty clear because they have this left-aligned basis where you can start from, you can read easily. It's pretty clear. All the lines are starting from the left. So that's generally what you want to go for. So next tip is that you want to limit the number of font sizes you choose to roughly 3 or 4. So I touched earlier on font selection. Font sizes is different. Font sizes is now that you have these fonts at your disposal, you don't want to have like 6 different sizes of the font that you're using. And this is one of the things that I think often gets looked over by many folks starting out with design. There's like a lot of different cases where they want to use their fonts. And so they think like, oh, in this case, I want the font to be really small, and here I want it to be really big. And what ends up happening is you have like 10 different types of font sizes on your page. And that actually, you might not notice it, creates a lot of vertical inconsistency, because all of these font sizes mean there's a bunch of different heights. And now you have a bunch of different recalculating that people are going to have to do subconsciously while they're reading your content. So avoid doing that. Avoid just defining like a extra large, large, medium, small, something like that. Maybe extra small if you really need it. But for the most part, you only need like 3 to 4 sizes for your fonts, and stick to those sizes. If you find that you need an in-between size, think of, instead of adding another size, think about maybe your small size is maybe too small. Maybe that small size needs to be bigger, and that's why you needed that in-between font. So basically just limit it. If you do really find out you need a lot more contrast between different font sizes, you probably should just look to different font weights instead. So font weights and colors will go a lot more, like a lot more farther when it comes to contrasting different texts. That's maybe more important than others. So what I mean by this, an example is this design agency called Collins. They actually have like 1 font size on everything. And so like all of their content you can see is actually has 1 font size, but they manage to differentiate it by using underlines, by using different text formats, such as the dates are with numbers, and so those stick out differently. They use line spacing in between different paragraphs to separate things. So this is an example of like, yeah, they managed to aesthetically communicate the font and clearly communicate different fonts and like different bits of information without having like a million different font sizes. Another thing that, so this is the next tip, another way to contrast different fonts. And what I mean here by contrast, I'm going to touch on that really quick. Contrast means that you essentially want to differentiate elements on your page. So that might be, you have like a header text and you have a body text, and you want to differentiate those. But sometimes you might want to have very nuanced differentiation. Like you might have, for example, a quote within your text. You want to style that a little differently than you would just a normal piece of like content, body text in your page. You've probably seen this on like any article, like a quote will be like taken out and styled a little bit differently. And that's done for contrast. That's done to highlight that the quote is different content than the rest of the page. It might not be like part of the same narrative. It might not be from a UI or a usability standpoint. It might not be as the same type of interaction as the rest of the page. So this is generally what I mean by contrast, is just the intention to separate these different elements. So going back to fonts, another way to differentiate them is, as I mentioned earlier, to contrast weights. And when you do so, generally speaking, you want to differentiate by a distance of 2. And so what that means is that, let's say you have light, thin, bold, medium, semi-bold, bold, heavy for your different font weights. And as I'm sure you've all probably seen like some version of this, probably haven't seen like half of these before, but you've probably seen like bold, at least. Everyone's seen bold. The idea is that you don't want to go from semi-bold to bold when you're trying to differentiate 2 different things. You want to go from medium to bold, and there you actually have a significant increase in contrast. And so it's very clear, like, oh, these are actually separate elements here. So to put this in an example, there's this website called Masterworks. It's pretty cool. I found it the other day. They let you invest in art and stuff. I always think that's cool. They have these really clear font weight distinctions in between the different bits of text on their page. They're also differentiating between it with font size, but I want to highlight like how they use color and font weight to differentiate the elements. And it helps you like identify what's the important part on each artist and their pieces. So moving on to tip 7. You want to, for legibility purposes, now that you've like figured out all of your font sizes, font weights, font colors, you want to keep the number of characters in each row to basically around 45 to 90 characters on each line. So that means like you have this many characters before it goes over to the next line and continues. This, I know like 45 to 90 is not like a small range. It's like the upper range of that is literally double the shorter range. But that's basically, I mean, you can basically have that wide of a tolerance when you're going with this. Just don't go way over or go way under. An example of like a lower on the lower end of characters per line that I found was this website called Playdate. It was this company, they made this gaming hardware system. It's really cool. It's like a Game Boy, but like has a crank on it. Anyways, they have this marketing website where there's very, very few words on each line, but it's spaced nicely and the font is a little ornamental. So they do it like that. They have everything big, nice line heights. And it's very nice and legible. And it also has like a really strong statement to it. On the other hand, you have a website like Medium where text is the core content of this. People are going to be reading tons and tons of text. So you don't want it to have it short, or else you're going to have like stupid long web pages where people are basically going to be scrolling forever. But you also don't want to have it too long so that people are like, you know, getting lost in each line and they don't know where to start on the next line because it's too freaking big. So they go for the upper end, but also keep it nice and short so that way you can have this really nice readable experience. Medium is just in general like a really great website to look at for typography because that's like the entirety of what they provide as a business. So definitely worth checking out if you haven't already. So we've covered how to use display fonts, we've covered how to use body fonts. One more thing before we go into the workshop I'm going to touch on is how to use fonts on the web. And there's just one tip I want to get across, and that's these two elements that you'll probably hear more about if you have not yet heard about in the world of dev, and that is font size and line height. So don't worry about like the specifics of this, but if you haven't learned about these already, there are two CSS properties. CSS is basically the programming language, I'm going to call it that, for how you lay out content on the web. And font size, I mean, pretty clearly it controls the font size of a font, while line height controls the amount of vertical space that font will take up. That might not make sense to you right now. You probably won't need to know about it anytime soon, but these are your friends. And you could like definitely dive into these slides later to figure out like to remember these names. The general rule of thumb, and this is like one of those things with an asterisk that I really want to emphasize, is that generally speaking, your line height will be 1.6 times your font size. So if your font size is 10, then your line height would be 16. This is not by any means like a strict rule. This is a general rule for legibility, is that if you want your font to be legible, you want to have your line height be about 1.6 times your font size. For different fonts, this might even be accounted for. A lot of fonts have legibility built into them, but in the situation that it doesn't, this is like the realm you want to be looking for. Yeah, that's basically it, I believe, in the world of the presentation part of this workshop. Now we're going to go to the workshop part of this workshop. So how we're going to do this is I did mention at the beginning, if you haven't yet, make sure you sign up for a Figma account and get that open. Sam, if you're there, could you drop the link in the chat? We have I prepared a file for this workshop. The file also has all the slides in the workshop itself. So you can just easily like check back and see everything I said. It might not make sense in context of just the slides, but this is also recorded. So you can cross-reference with that, do as you wish. Okay, cool. Sam posted the link. It should go to here, let me pull it up. It should go to, oh, don't look at that, that's some work stuff. This page, which is a community page, where you can download, oh, cool, the number is going up, that's cool, you can see it live. or you can download the workshop to your local Figma file. You're going to see that there's 3 pages on the workshop. There's a presentation page, and then there's 2 workshop pages. We're gonna start off at workshop number 1. So your workshop, the page should look like this. I'll explain what this is in a second. I'm just gonna give a bit for folks to download, to duplicate this workshop. So yeah, just go to that link. If that link's not working for you, you can just go to, oh, oops. Yeah, go to this URL, figma.com/@Justin. Yeah, I'm flexing my handle, but basically just go, if you go to that, you'll get taken to my page, and you can just click on the one that says Bloom Typography Workshop if you haven't yet. So I'm gonna give it like a minute or 2. This link or the link in chat, both work. At 5:46, I'll continue. Yeah. Oh yeah, and like Sam mentioned, if you have any questions, just drop it in the chat. I'll definitely get around to it, I promise. If not, you can tell everyone at Creative Labs that I suck and that I should have answered your question. So feel free to answer any questions. I think you can also, yeah, you can also just send, if you're like, don't want to answer a question publicly, you can just send me a question privately. I'll answer your question to everyone without saying your name. In case that's like, you know, I want to make sure that everyone feels welcome to ask any questions without judgment. So, all right. Give it another minute and we'll hop into the workshop. Okay, yeah, so the difference here, I'll hop back into the slides. Yeah, oh, you know what, you're right, I totally didn't cover the important difference between grotesque fonts and geometric and humanist fonts. Okay, so this is what I meant by I was like really forgetful. A grotesque font is sort of like the halfway in between a humanist and geometric font. And what that means is that it takes on a lot of the properties of humanist fonts that have a lot more natural strokes, which means that your E's aren't going to be perfectly circular. There's a lot more way that the curves in these fonts travel. They have like a much more human-like motion to them. But they take on the properties of geometric fonts because the stroke width of these fonts tend to stay a lot more consistent. So in this case, the Helvetica is like, looks like a bolder version of Lato, but it's not always a case that a grotesque font might be bolder. In fact, there's a lot of thin variants of grotesque fonts and a lot of bold variants of humanist fonts. It's just that in this particular example, it just looks larger. Yeah, so I would say like if there's a spectrum, it's like geometric is super like rigid, robotic, like computer, and then humanist fonts are like human, very like handwritten side. Grotesque fonts are like somewhere in that middle. Yep, you covered this. I'm curious why not Times New Roman is often like the standard font. Yeah, that's a good question. I actually don't know the exact reason why. I know that Roman fonts are like considered traditional when it comes to text. Times New Roman is like in that world of like Roman serif fonts. Yeah, so on print, serif fonts tend to be easier to read. Of course, this is like not a sweeping statement. There are some edge cases, but typically when you're on paper and you're older, the serifs make it easier to identify individual letters. So they found, I think there's like a study finding that you don't read faster, but you read more clearly with serif fonts. And especially as you like are older, you're someone who's like an elder type of person, basically. I don't know the right language to use there. I'm sorry. The serif fonts are probably going to be easier on your eyes, just so that you can distinguish different letters. All right, I'm gonna answer this one question and then hop into the workshop. What was that book you read the quote about typography from? Oh yeah, that's this book right here. It's a new program for graphic design by David Reinfurt. I literally just started reading it, but the first section is entirely about typography. So that's where I've been like getting a lot of information from and trying to learn more about fonts in general. It's a really cool book. It's very history dense. Like when I mentioned earlier that history is like an important aspect about fonts, this is sort of what I was mentioning about. They cover like a lot of where fonts came from, why fonts are fonts, basically everything you need to know about the context of fonts, which is like super important to know. Really cool book. I think I actually have a link to it at the end of my slides. So you can definitely check that out later. Shout out to Michael Yu, another Creative Labs, former Creative Labs member who's now an alumni with me, who showed me this book. All right, cool. Let us hop into the workshop. So you're gonna see all of this. Let me break down what this is. So what this workshop is basically going to be is trying to identify fonts using the characteristics we sort of went over. In particular, we're going to be using Google Fonts. So Google Fonts is, as you might guess, Google's free. I'm going to see if I can pull up Google Fonts on. Oh, don't see that. We're going to minimize that. Don't look at what's on the page. Oh wait, you can't see that because I'm only showing Figo, right? Perfect. Okay. Let me see if I can share. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Share screen. Share. All right. Can you see this? Google Fonts. I also can't see chat anymore. Okay.
Yeah, you're good, Justin.
All right, sick. Cool. So Google Fonts is a great resource for not just using fonts, but learning about fonts in general. And what we're going to use specifically in Google Fonts is the search feature, the search and the categorical search to basically identify fonts. So Google, for example, has these categories, which has some of the categories I covered before, but also some additional ones for how to search by categories. There's different languages. For the most part, for the entire part, we're not going to be using anything other than English, so don't worry about this. And then we have font properties. So this is what you're probably going to be using a bit to identify the fonts in the workshop. But you can also just try and use your eye. And what I mean by that is in this workshop, what the task of this workshop is sort of like a puzzle. You're going to try and figure out what font the reference image uses. So in this example, we have the word vibe check with like some like patterns going on with the stroke. Strokes is basically the border of a shape. And we're going to try and replicate it by changing the font of this text right here. So I set up the document so that if you change this font, it should change the font right here. So let's see if we did it right. So I'm gonna change it to let's go to, I probably have different fonts than y'all, but let's just do this one, for example. Will that work? Yeah, so if I change that font, it's going to change the font up here. And the goal is to basically match this font right here. And how you're going to do that is you're going to go into here and say, okay, what do I need to search to sort of categorize this font? What categories should I have checked? What properties should I be looking for? Don't worry about the number of styles property. Actually, that one's not going to be used. But the thickness, slant, and width, those are things that you might find helpful for identifying this font. So for example, let's say I'm looking for, I don't know, a serif font. I can just uncheck all of those and it will only show me serif fonts. I can try and look for like very thick serif fonts and it'll show, oh, there's actually no very thick serif fonts, okay. But there's like other thick serif fonts that I can look for. Clearly none of these are the font that is in that workshop, but you know, I don't want to give away too many hints. If you do find out that you need a hint, you can delete one of these. I mean, preferably delete the one on the leftmost because it's the least specific, and it'll behind it is a little hint that'll sort of get you on the right path for this. You'll know that you're correct because this graphic down below should be completely black. If you have the right font, basically there's a little bit of math going on with this graphic. It'll be completely black and it'll confirm that you have the right font. So you don't need to change the line height or anything. You just need to click on here and wait, my Figma is visible, right? Just want to make sure I'm not just like clicking on like my desktop. It is? All right, cool. Yeah, you just want to go into here, double click into here and try and figure out what font it's using. And the other reason why we're using Google Fonts is that Figma actually imports all of the Google fonts by default. So you should have all Google fonts available inside Figma already. You don't need to install fonts or anything. So it's not going to be anything that's not on Google Fonts. So yeah. So I guess try and go for it. Well, I'll have like 5-10 minutes to do this workshop, and then I'll introduce the next workshop, which is like unbounded by time. Then we'll have Q&A. Yeah. The link to the project. Oh yeah, Sam's got it. I'm curious. I want to see like who can deduce what font this is with. I mean, the hints kind of give it away, but if you want to try and challenge yourself and not use the hints, if you find it without using the hints, drop the name. Actually, no, privately DM me on Zoom, and I will shout you out. But don't use the hints if you're gonna do that, or else that's like cheating. Brian, you can't participate in this challenge. We went over this yesterday. I guess I shouted you out anyways. Okay, you got me. I got baited. Yeah. Yo, that was fast. All right. Oh wow, y'all are really fast. All right. Oh, okay. There's like a lot coming in. The first one who got it was I don't want to butcher your name. Ty Koslowski. Shout out to Ty for getting that one. Oh, awesome. Yeah. Yeah, Brian and I was trying to guide Brian through this workshop the other day, and it was tough. I'm gonna have an honorary second and third shout out because it was really close to Christy Hong for second place and Alice Wong for third place. Y'all like really messaged me real fast, so mad props to you for getting the right font. I'll reveal the font in 5 minutes, so we can move on to the next workshop and have time for Q&As. Actually, I'll just move on in 2 minutes, so that way we can. I think you could probably work on this on on your own if you want to keep challenging yourself. I definitely tried to make sure like I deleted all of the fonts remaining, any like remnant of it, everything's like converted to a shape. So you shouldn't be able to find it by digging through any of the layers and stuff. Google Fonts is a really, really cool resource. Definitely recommend if you're like learning about fonts. I mean, even if you already know about fonts, you probably know about Google Fonts already, but it's a great resource for free fonts. You can use them. You'll probably be using them on your website that you make in this workshop, just because there's like such a wide selection and they have like really good tools to help you use the fonts and import them. I think, and it's all free. And that's the best part. Many, many great fonts. What is a retro font? Great question, Brian. The retro is not really a like specific category of font. It's just the adjective I was using to describe that one font earlier in the workshop. Let's see if I can find it here. Yeah, just because it has a style similar to, I guess I would say like a family of retro fonts from like the advertising in the 1960s to 1980s. It's and these really fat serif fonts haven't been popular for a while, but they sort of came back. Yeah, like Woodstock. A very close font that actually you probably heard of because Vox made a video on it recently. It's called Cooper Black. I'm gonna type in chat. Cooper Black. It's this retro font that actually I'll just bring it up. It's this retro font that was used a lot in like advertising, and you've definitely seen it before. It's making a comeback now because of its really iconic look, and because like retro is just coming back in general, vintage, retro, whatever you want to call it. It's used a lot on a lot of old album covers, just like a lot of stuff in general. And it's very closely tied, and this is what I was talking about earlier about understanding history and politics. It's very closely tied to the civil rights movement, I believe. I might be getting that wrong, but Vox has a great video on it. If you just search up Vox Google Fonts, you'll find like a great breakdown of why this font is very iconic. Anyways, super cool font, used everywhere. You get like a lot of extra style points if you use it in general. So yeah. All right, we've wrapped up the time for the first workshop. I'm not going to give away the answer because you can basically get the answer by deleting hint 3. So if you want to, do that on your own time. We're gonna move on to workshop 2. So workshop 2 is just a harder version of workshop 1, where instead of identifying one font, you're going to try and identify multiple fonts. So there's 3 different fonts in this example. We have a font for the details on this left example. We have a font for the heading. We have a font for the body text. So you can change this, and if you change it, for example, it's defaulted to Roboto. But if, for example, I change it to Rockwell, you'll see on the right side that the font updates with it. And then in addition to just the font selection, you're also going to have to change the font size to match the left. So remember what I mentioned about legibility. You probably want to look at how to change the font size to make the text legible and clear. As you see, like all of this text is very densely packed together. You can change it by just selecting on the text again and then controlling this value over here. So yeah, the other purpose of this secondary workshop is to also sort of experiment, give you a way to experiment with text without having to worry about laying out text and different sizes. So you can just go back to this workshop whenever you want. And let's say like you're trying to figure out what text to use on your workshop. You can just change it here, figure out a font that you want, and just see how it compares. You can also, change the heading and see like maybe I want something that's like, I don't know, really, really bold. Let's go to Google Fonts and do an example. I'm gonna do a serif, actually a sans serif font and display font and look for something that is not width, thickness. And the thick font. Here we go. Okay, I'm gonna do, let's do work sans. So I could change this to work sans. Oh, did that change? Yeah, it changed. And I can change it to like extra bold. And I can change it to like 4. Oh, that's too big. I can change it to 36. No, that's too big. Okay, we'll keep it at 24. And now I can like sort of preview what this might look like. I think the cool thing is if I change the text to, it should also change up there. So you can sort of like use this as a quick layout tool if you ever find yourself using it. Sam, no, it's not Corbin. But yeah, so unlike the previous one, there is no like answer check on this one. This one is mainly just to use as a tool, honestly. You can use the hints to also reveal what the different body text font is, and then the line height as well as the detail font and header font. Yeah, I mean, feel free to allow it on this. I won't do shout outs for finding it first, just because I want to have time for Q&A in case there's any more questions. I guess we can do both. If you figure out what font it is without using the hints, and I'm trusting you on this one, without using the hints, DM me and I will shout you out. You'll find all 3 fonts. So just message me what they all are, and I'll do a shout out. And I guess, and oh yeah, 3 fonts and the line height. That's also the important part, figuring out what line height to use. Okay, with that, I'm gonna, I guess we can open it up to any questions and answers, or I guess I'd be doing the answers, but if you have any questions, DM me privately and I can answer them publicly, or just send it in the chat and I'll answer it to the best of my ability. Yeah. Oh, one more thing before we hop into that. In the slides too, I also have some resources that you can check out. There's Google Fonts. There's a link to Google Fonts. There's some websites that are great for learning about fonts. There's a Coursera course that's really good for learning about fonts. There's that book I mentioned. There's the 2 fonts I've used in this workshop. Because I'm a designer, I have to shout out the fonts I use. It's just like a thing you do. And yeah, I guess thanks for coming. I'll answer any questions you have to the best of my ability. Wow. Quick shout out to Daniel Dye for getting the correct values of the, that was really, really fast. But yes, those are all correct. Yeah, thank you all for coming. That makes sense. You've probably seen this font like so much. It's a great font. Yeah, thank you all for coming. I'll save it. I'll save it at the very end for the OGs.